Welcome to Excel magic trick number 1326. Hey, if you want to download this Excel file, Excel magic trick 1326 start or the finished file so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, this video we want to see how to conditionally format text modes, and we're going to see three methods: pivot table, array formula, and Power Query. Now, the first thing is, what is a mode calculation? Well, here we have some survey data for a new soda, and the responses were things like, I don't like it at all, I like it somewhat good, terrible, or even really good. And how do we calculate a mode? Well, a mode is a type of average. And anytime you have categorical data like that, that means it's not a number. We can't calculate an average, meaning add them all up, divide by the count. So the mode means let's find the one that occurs most frequently. So if it turns out that good was the number one response, then that would be the mode. Now, we're going to do this three ways. The pivot table way is kind of the cheap and dirty way. We can do it for a one-time event. But the array formula and the Power Query will be dynamic, meaning if the data changes, so will the result. All right, now I'm going to click in a single cell, and I want to build a pivot table. Because a pivot table is easy. We drag survey data to the rows and then survey data to the values, and instantly we get a count for all of the items. Now notice this data set has a space. Now the solution would be much easier, especially when we get to the array formula and Power Query, if we didn't have spaces. But I'm going to assume that we might have some empty responses. All right, so what would happen if I went up to Insert, Pivot Table, or I used the keyboard Alt-N-V? Well, of course, this is not a proper data set. Check that out. The cursor was in a single cell, so it hunted for empty spaces all the way around. Of course, this disconnects the bottom part from the top part. So we have to be careful. We need to highlight the entire table manually. I'm going to highlight and then use the keyboard Control-Shift-Down arrow. Now we have our table. I want to put this on an existing sheet. Now watch this. I clicked in Location, and I'm noticing that there's a collapse button, and I don't want to scroll up to get to the top. So watch this. I'm going to use Control-Home. That just temporarily got me up to the top. Now I'm going to click in cell C5 and click OK. Now, here's our one field. We drag it down to the rows, and instantly we get a unique list, including our blank, or in our case, an empty cell. Now we drag survey data down to values, and instantly we get a count. I'm immediately going to get rid of row labels, design, layout, report layout, and show in tabular. Now that's all we need to do with our pivot table. I'm going to close the field list. And now we can come over to the filter, not sort A to Z. I want sort more options. And I want to sort descending, not on the survey data. That's the label, but the count of survey data. So there it is. Click OK. And wait a second, there's a tie. Yes, sometimes we don't have a single mode. We have multiple modes. So it looks like if I'm going to conditionally format this, I need to conditionally format every time we find somewhat, not at all, or good. Now I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to come over to the side. Actually, I'm going to highlight the label and then copy the three modes, Control-C, come over here, Control-V. Now, we need to use a formula, a logical formula. And once we have that formula, we can highlight all the data, go up to Home, conditionally format. And guess what? There's not a built-in feature that I know of that can check an item against a list of items like we have. So we're actually going to have to use a formula. So before I go back up there and create the formula, I actually would rather create the formula in the cells, copy it down, see if the pattern of trues and falses will work. And then once I get the formula working out here, I can copy and paste it into the dialog box up there. Now, I actually want to add an extra column here, so I'm going to click on the C, right-click, Insert. Or actually, there's a keyboard, I for Insert, C for Column, Alt-I-C. Now, let's come over right next to the data set, and guess what? How do I check if that item is over in this list? Well, the most efficient way is to use the match function. Match function is a lookup function. I can say, hey, match, go look this up, comma, within this lookup array. And the lookup array always has to be a one-way array because match will simply look through and tell you where it found it in the list positionally. I'm going to hit F4. Match will look through, find it in the second position, so match will return a 2, comma. Now, this list over here is not sorted, so I'm going to use exact match 0, close parentheses. Now, remember, conditional formatting needs a true and false. A true would tell the cell to have formatting. A false would say not to have the formatting. So when we enter this formula, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Whoops, I got tricked by that space, right? I'm going to drag it down here, double click and send it down. Wait a second, our formula is giving us numbers and NA. Well, guess what? The logical features in Excel, whether it's the if function or the and function or function or conditional formatting, interpret any non-zero number as true. So the conditional formatting dialog box will interpret that as true, true. Not only that, unlike formulas, the conditional formatting dialog box is not bothered when it sees an error. Because if it sees an error, it just doesn't apply the formatting. So that's the formula. Now notice, we're in the cells and we copied it down a column. But when we very carefully copy the formula in edit mode, Control-C, escape, and I'm going to highlight the whole data set, Control-Shift down arrow. And I want to jump back to the top, so I'm going to use Control backspace, which jumps back to the active cell. By highlighting all the cells, when we go up to Home, Conditional Formatting, New Rule, or the keyboard Alt-HLN, I want to use a formula to determine which cells to format. I can click on that, or I can hit Page Down. Now, I come over here, and it says Format Values where this formula is true. I simply paste it. But notice I'm right here, so I'm going to hit Tab, and now I Control-V. Now, that formula will be in this dialog box. And in memory, it will copy it down, and it will be as if it is in every single cell. So when it sees a number, boom, the formatting will be applied. An error, it will not be applied. Click Format, and you can apply whichever format you want. I'm going to say yellow. Click OK, click OK, and just like that, we have conditionally formatted all of the modes. Now, this column of formulas right here, Control-Shift down arrow, Control backspace, we actually don't need this anymore. So if I hit the Delete key, of course this conditional formatting will work because the formula we put up into the dialog box is still there. Control-Z. I'm going to leave this here as a trail. I'm going to point to the edge of the highlight, and when I see my Move cursor, I'm going to click and drag over here. I'm just going to leave it there so when you download it, you can see what we did. Now, this is not dynamic. The values actually change here. It will not automatically change the conditional formatting. So let's go see our second method using an array formula. So I'm going to go over to 1326 array. Now, back in Excel Magic Trick 118, we actually saw a series of formulas that extract all of the modes. So if I come over here and if I was to delete this, delete, you can see that formula for extracting updates. And because it's a formula, it updates instantly. We don't have to refresh like in a pivot table or Power Query. Now I'm going to Control-Z. My goal here is actually to conditionally format this. Just have the data set here, and if anything changes, have the conditional formatting change. Now, same thing as our last example. I'm actually going to create this array formula in the cell, copy it down, and see if we can get our patterns of trues and falses or non-zero numbers and errors. All right. Well, the first problem is going to be we would like to use the mode.multiple function because that function can look at a data set and extract simultaneously all of the modes. But it only works on number data. So our first task is to take these text values and get numbers that represent them that we can dump into the mo.multiple. Well, guess what? I'm using the match function. Match function looks something up, returns the relative position of the item in the list, just like we saw in our first example. But I need to simultaneously get a number for everything in this column. So instead of giving the lookup value argument a single value, I'm going to highlight the entire column. So I'm going to highlight Control Shift down arrow and F4 because I need to lock that as I copy it down. Now this is called a function argument array operation. It's expecting a single item. I'm giving it multiple items. That forces the function match to spit out simultaneously an answer for every single item I put in there. Now, so it'll simultaneously look all of these up, comma. Lookup array, it's exactly the same range. So watch this. I'm going to click on that lookup value, Control C. I'm actually going to have to use that range a bunch of times. Control V. And because this list is not sorted and we have lots of duplicates, comma, we want to use exact match. Now I'm going to put a 0 here. And really, it's not because it's sorted. It's because there's duplicates. And because we have not at all here and not at all here, when match finds the relative position for the first one, because we gave it exact match 0, it will only find the first one. So actually, in the resultant array that this spits out, there'll be a 1 there, a 1 there, 1 and 1. So in essence, we will have converted the text values to a relative position number. Close parentheses. And I'm going to hit F9 to evaluate this. There it is. Exactly. I think we have 6 values. So there's actually 6 unique values here. 1 for not at all, 2 for somewhat. And let's see, 22 is, I think, for really good down here. But that NA will cause us trouble. Control Z. If I tried to put it in mo.multiple, it just wouldn't work. The NA would cause trouble. So I'm going to filter this resultant array with the if function. Logical test, I need to look through here and somehow determine when there's some text. So I'm going to use the isText function. Control V, because it's looking through the same range. Close parentheses and comma. Now, logical test, it'll give us true, true, false when it sees something that's not text. That will then filter the values here. And the trick is we want a false in the resultant array, so the value of false. I don't put anything there. I'm actually going to just leave it out. By leaving it out, it will insert a false. You ready? Cursor at the end, F9. There is my resultant array of relative positions that represent text values, but now they're numbers. Not only that, but the false value, Control Z, when I put an array into any aggregate function, mo.multiple is an aggregate function. When I put an array with logical values like true and falses, it will ignore them. So the false value representing that empty cell will be ignored. Close parentheses, cursor at the end, F9. That is awesome. 1 relative position, 2 relative position, and the 6 relative position. Those are the relative positions of our 3 modes. Control Z. Now all I have to do is put it inside of a lookup function because I don't need the numbers. I want the actual text values. So index, in the array, those are the values I want to look up. Control V, comma. In the row number, if I hit F9, we can see that it says 1, 2, and 6. But actually, index will not be able to interpret all of these simultaneously and return 3 items simultaneously. Control Z to check that that's actually true. Let's come to the end, close parentheses, and F9. It can only see the first relative position in the row number argument. Control Z. Well, over about the last 50 videos, I learned this great trick by using the N, if, and 1 formula element to get a function to return multiple items simultaneously. And I have a bunch of videos on them. This one explains and shows it for the first time. And it is kind of mysterious. We've actually had some discussions below these videos and talked about the history and looked at a blog. And it's kind of unclear exactly how it's working. But watch this. end tab, if tab, 1 comma. By combining these functions and putting the array of items we want the index function to respect, by putting it inside of here, somehow this combination of functions will force index when I hit the F9 key to deliver exactly what we want. Those are the text modes. Now remember, as I copy this down, I need each cell to check if it's in this list. So Control Z. Now I simply use that resultant array inside the match function. I want to look up each individual value as I copy it down, comma. That lookup array is the 3 text items. I come to the end, comma 0, because the list is not sorted, close parentheses. Now, this is an array formula. We have a bunch of array calculations, particularly in the if, that will require that we use Control-Shift-Enter for entering the formula into the cell. So I'm going to use Control, Shift, and Enter. Immediately I go up to the formula bar. The curly brackets is Excel telling you it understood that that was an array calculation and calculated it correctly. Our Control-Shift-Enter was us telling Excel. Those curly brackets are Excel telling us it understood. All right, ready? I'm going to drag it down and then double-click and send it down. And there we go. There's our patterns of non-zero numbers, which means true for conditional formatting, and the errors will mean false. Now remember, we actually had to use Control-Shift-Enter, but when I copy this in edit mode, highlight, Control-C, Escape. When I highlight this entire range, Control-Shift-Down arrow, Control backspace, and go up to Home, Conditional Formatting, New Rules, or Alt-HLN. Use formula to determine. I either click or hit Page Down. Format values where this formula is true. I either click or hit Tab, Control-V. Now remember, that's an array formula. And in the cells, it required Control-Shift-Enter, but we do not have that same requirement in the conditional formatting dialog box. It'll just understand it. So I click Format, yellow or whatever formatting you want, click OK, click OK. And just like that, it is. And again, we do not need these formulas. If I delete them, it works perfectly. And if I change this, instantly the conditional formatting updates. Now let's go over to the pivot table sheet, and let's delete that same somewhat. This conditional formatting will disappear, but none of these will. So delete. Oh, look at that. So this isn't as dynamic as that formula. Control-Z. Back over here on the array formula. All of the somewhats do not have that formatting. If I type somewhat here again, when I hit Enter, instantly this is dynamic. Now I'm going to Control-Z to leave that as a trail. All right, so we saw pivot tables and array formulas. The array formulas will be the most automatic and dynamic, but Power Query, or in 2016 it's called Get and Transform. So if you come over to this sheet, Data. And there it is, 2016. It's automatically built in. We don't have to download Power Query like we did in Excel 2013 or 2010. There it is, Get and Transform. We will be able to take this data set, create a list of text modes, and then we'll use the conditional formatting feature to point to that list of modes. Now, in order to get data in Excel into Power Query, you have to convert it to an Excel table. So Control-Shift-Down arrow. Control-T to convert it to a table. Click OK. Now, once it's a table, we definitely need to give it a good name. Design over here to Properties up here, or we can use the keyboard Alt-JTA. And I'm going to name this Survey Data and Enter. All right, we have a single cell selected. Data from table. That's the button you use when your data is in Excel in an Excel table. Or we can use the keyboard Alt-APT. Our query editor window will come up. It took the name of the table. I definitely want to rename this query, so we'll call this List of Modes when I hit Enter. The great thing about that is it will also be the name of the table when we load this back to Excel. All right, so here's our column. I want to get rid of the nulls. Power Query is just simply amazing. All I have to do is use the filter feature. Uncheck this, click OK. And whenever I export back to Excel, will not include those empty cells or nulls. You can see that step got added there. Now this is all the values. And remember, I only want a little short list. So I'm actually going to right-click the field name and point to drill down to give us a list. Now there it is. Look up in the formula bar, filtered list of survey data. And I just have to tell it, hey, filtered list, I want a list dot of modes. You've got to be kidding me. Open parentheses, close parentheses. Now it's very important over here in Power Query. Case matters. So it's list, what type of list, dot, please give me the modes. When I hit enter, that is amazing. Now we have to take this list and convert it to a table. So I click to table. We don't need any delimiters. We don't need to worry about errors, so I click OK. There's our steps. We only have one step left. Actually, I want to double-click column name and call this modes enter. Now our last step, we come up to close and load to. I definitely want it in a table. On this existing sheet, I'm thinking I'm going to put it in E5. I'm simply going to type E5, click load. And there it is. If we ever need to come back and edit it later, we simply right-click Edit. If that window is closed, you simply come up to Data and Show Queries. Now we have to build our formula, and I want to notice something. If I say match, since this is an Excel table, if I click on a relative cell reference, it puts in table formula nomenclature, comma. If I highlight this, that's table formula nomenclature. And I actually don't know how to get the table formula nomenclature to work in the conditional formatting dialog box. So I'm actually going to use regular cell references. We're still going to use match. I need to, and this is a relative cell reference A6, so I type A6, comma. Lookup, I'm going to cheat here. I'm going to highlight one cell below and then drag up. Hit F4 to lock it, and then backspace and type an 8. These references will work with these table features. What that means is if this table expands or contracts, that cell reference will expand or contract. Comma, 0, close parentheses. That will tell us relative position, Control-C, arrow, arrow, Control, down, arrow, a bunch, arrow, arrow, Control-Shift, up arrow, Control-V. Now, I want to jump up to the top and notice my active cell is at the bottom, but Control period jumps back to the next corner in your highlighted range. All right, so that's the same patterns we saw for non-zero numbers, which means true, it's in our list, or errors, which means it's not in the list. All right, so I'm going to highlight this formula in edit mode. Control-C, escape. Now I highlight, Control-Shift, down arrow, and go up to Home, Conditional Formatting, New Rule. Or I can use the keyboard Alt-HLN. Here's our dialog box. I want Use Formula to determine which cells to format. Either click or hit Page Down. Then we want to paste our formulas in the text box. Format values where this formula is true. Either click or hit Tab and then Control-V. Format whatever you want. I'm going to use yellow. Click OK. Click OK. And that is looking good. Now, let's see if it works like the array formula or the pivot table. I'm going to select someone, and when I delete it, well, it looks like it's working like the pivot table. Yes, we have an extra step. We have to refresh our query. Right-click Refresh. But just like that, that range expanded. Our formula totally understands. And now if I were to change it yet again, somewhat, and enter, right-click Refresh, and everything is dynamic. All right, conditionally formatting modes that happen to be text values. We saw Power Query. We saw an array formula, and we saw a quick and dirty pivot table method. All right, we'll see you next video.